Yeah, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 5. Hope everyone's off to a good start this week. We are in week 5, which means that we are quickly approaching the end of our time together. Thank you very much for the accountability and ethics papers. I've gone through all of those that were submitted and have graded those and provided feedback. All very good news with those. The grades were all in the A and B range, and so I think everyone did a very nice job on those papers. Yeah, unfortunately for us, there's no lack of examples of ethical violations to choose from. And so I think the problem wasn't, finding an ethical violation, it was picking which ethical violation to focus on because there are unfortunately just so many. And so many recently with the LA City Council. I know many people talked about some of those ethical violations from members of City Council. And so I think everyone did a really nice job of identifying those ethical violations. And then also did a really nice job of then tying those ethical evaluations to the different types of ethics that we discussed in class as well. For most of them, they touched upon all of the different types of accountability. They touched on, fiscal, they touched on policy, they touched on process. And so it's pretty common to see that one ethical violation cover all three of those. So I think people did a really nice job on that. So from a content perspective, papers were very, very good. Also, overall, I thought the papers were very well written. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate the time and effort you put into crafting those papers and proofreading those papers. Just a couple of small points moving forward in future courses when you're writing additional papers in future courses. One point is you try and avoid using contractions in formal papers. And so if you use contractions, I probably put a little annotation by the first two or three of those and then stopped after that. But try avoiding using contractions in formal papers, number one. The second piece of advice is in terms of APA format, and we spent time going over APA format, but I didn't deduct a lot of points from you if the paper was not in APA format. But one of the things to remember is that APA 7th is a little weird in terms of how we cite sources. Remember, in APA format, not every word in the article title is capitalized, only the first word, and then if there's a colon, the first word after the colon. Proper nouns are also capitalized in article titles. Other than that, then we shouldn't have words capitalized in the article titles, which is kind of counterintuitive to the way in which we usually function in life, but that's APA 7th. And then the other thing in APA 7th is to make sure when you are including the journal title to put the journal title in italics. And so just a couple little points in APA that will be helpful for you as you move forward in future courses. Now, I also thought since we are at this point in the class and you finished up your accountability and ethics paper, it would probably be a good time at the outset of class tonight to talk about some of those upcoming assignments that we have right around the corner. So on the screen, I'm sharing out with you the multimedia assignment, and we'll talk a little bit about that again, just so everyone's clear on what's going on with that assignment, because it's kind of an unusual, unconventional type of assignment that you oftentimes see in a lot of graduate courses. And then after we talk about this, then we'll talk about that final assessment. I'll take you through the different scenarios on the final assessment, so we can kind of see how those two assignments are going to work as you'll begin your progress of putting those assignments together. So let's start with the multimedia assignment. Again, this is kind of an unconventional assignment, but the reason why I like to use this type of assignment is that so often in public administration, we are making proposals and we are doing presentations, oftentimes to elected officials. And so you might be making a presentation to city council, to a governing board, to a legislative committee. And so it's a really good skill to have, how to make these presentations, how to communicate your information in an engaging way where you can engage the audience and to do it in a very concise and very brief manner. If you have made presentations to governing bodies before, you know that your presentation is one item on probably a very lengthy agenda. And so you're not going to have a whole lot of time for your presentation. And sometimes the longer our presentations, the more we run the risk of losing the attention span of our audience and then really failing to accomplish our goals with that presentation. So what I'm hoping to do with this assignment is, if you haven't done a lot of presentations before, to give you the opportunity to put together a presentation whereby you are presenting the creation of a new task force. So, and the purpose of this assignment is that you should think about an issue or a problem that affects public administration. That issue can be a policy issue, and so it could be something revolve around the issue of homelessness. It could be a reduction in crime, could be something environmental in nature. The last time I used this assignment, a student put together a task force that looked at deficit reduction and created a deficit reduction task force whereby local governments joined together in a task force to come up with strategies and share ideas about how to decrease their expenditures and increase their revenues to come to a balanced budget more easily than they've been able to achieve in the past. You could think about maybe an ethics task force to draw on some of the information from the ethics paper, how governments may want to join together in order to put together ethics training programs, or whatever the case may be. The choice of the issue or the problem, completely up to you. All I ask that it's a contemporary issue or problem that directly affects public administration, governmental organizations. And then what you will do in this presentation is you will be putting together a task force. And the goal of that task force is to try and address that current issue or that problem. So as you think about this assignment, as you think about putting your task force together, first you'll start with whatever issue or problem you're trying to address. And then in your presentation, as you present your task force to me, you should cover 6 different areas. I've got those listed there on the syllabus. The first thing you'll address in your presentation is the purpose of the task force. Now, logically, the primary purpose of the task force will be to try and eliminate this problem, or at least to try and reduce the magnitude of whatever problem that task force is meant to try and address. So the purpose of the task force, kind of what its mission is, why that task force is being created to begin with. Then secondly, discuss some of the agencies or organizations, whether they be public, nonprofit, maybe even private in nature, that will be involved in this task force. So with these task forces, we're going to have collaboration between different organizations. So which organizations will be involved in the collaborations going on in this task force? And again, they can be public, they can be private, they can be nonprofit, they can be federal, they can be state, they can be local, just whatever makes sense to you for your task force. So if perhaps you have a task force that is intended to try and reduce the instances of drunk driving in a region, you're probably going to have local police departments that are involved in that task force. You're probably going to have the LA County Sheriff's Department that's involved in that task force. So those are going to be the types of agencies that will be involved in that type of a task force. So who are the agencies who are involved? The number 3, what are the roles of those agencies? We know whenever we have collaboration between different agencies, some agencies tend to take the lead, while other agencies are more secondary in nature. So what are the lead agencies in this task force? So, perhaps in our drunk driving type of example, you may have one specific police force that is a real problem in their community. So they're kind of the champions. They're the driving force behind putting this organization together. They might be the ones who have the lead and be the lead agency. So what are some of the roles of the different agencies that are involved in this task force? Then number 4, how will the task force be staffed? Obviously, if we're putting this task force together, we're going to have people who are working in this task force. So are we going to draw people from the member agencies to work in this task force? Are we going to have to go out there and hire additional people to work in the task force? What types of positions do we need to hire for? So are we going to need to have policy analysts? Are we going to need to have budget analysts? And the types of positions that you'll need the organization, the task force, will obviously depend upon whatever issue or problem that task force is addressing. So basically, how are you going to staff it? What types of positions are you going to need? And how are you going to get those people to work in the task force? The number 5, how will the task force be funded? This is an important one because if you fund the task force through appropriations, then that means that your presentation is certainly going to be geared toward elected officials because they have the power of the purse strings. They're the ones who are going to be making those appropriations decisions. If, however, your task force is going to be funded by seeking out grants, then this might be a presentation you'll be giving to donors. And so your audience for your presentation will be a little bit different. If you're making a presentation to donors as opposed to elected officials, you may have some different strategies that you would want to use. So how are you proposing to fund this task force? And then how will we measure the effectiveness of this task force? Ostensibly, if we're putting this task force together, it's meant to try and address or mitigate some type of an issue. So how do we know that it's being successful in addressing and mitigating that issue? So what I'm looking for in your presentation is that you will address these 6 points that I've laid out for you there in the syllabus. Each one of those sections of your presentation will be worth 15 points for a total of 90 points. And then there's a 10-point overall presentation quality component. For this presentation quality component, what I'm looking at is I'm looking at the professionalism of the presentation. So is a professional presentation, is it engaging? Does it engage the interest of your audience? Those are the types of things I'm looking at in terms of overall quality of presentation. Are we expected to come up with a budget? Common question to come up, how much is that going to cost? Yeah, I think you don't have to come up with a line item budget, but what I would expect that you would have kind of a ballpark figure for how much this task force will cost in terms of startup costs and then ongoing costs. Because you're right, if you're presenting this to elected officials, their primary question is going to be, well, what's this going to cost us? Because whenever you create a task force and you appropriate money to that task force, there are clearly opportunity costs because those are monies that cannot be spent elsewhere. So it's just kind of a ballpark figure. This is what it will cost to start up the task force. This is what it would cost to keep the task force going on an annual basis. Lindsay asks, are we able to use a real life issue that we are currently dealing with in our organization, redacting information? Absolutely. And that oftentimes works best because then you have a tangible situation that you have experience with. And yeah, redact whatever information you feel necessary to redact, but I think that's a great strategy to use. Jeremy asked, would it include administrative costs? Would it be considered the cooperation of existing position or participating member agencies? There will be some administrative costs that are certainly involved in this task force. The question will be, are those administrative costs going to be covered out of the budgets of the existing agencies who are participating in this task force? Or are you going to have to go out there and seek additional appropriations or additional grant money in order to pay those administrative costs? I think that question is best answered by thinking about, number one, the magnitude of the problem that's being addressed. So if this is a huge problem, like homelessness or something like that, that is going to require kind of a all hands on deck type of an approach that will require a lot of investment of money to either construct housing or put together voucher programs or whatever approach the task force is going to use. And that's going to be a very costly type of endeavor. And the participating agencies may not have the fiscal wherewithal to actually be able to pay for that. However, it's a more marginal type of issue that's not going to cost that much. Maybe the existing agencies can contribute a small fraction of their budget to cover those types of administrative costs. But again, I'm not expecting you to break the costs down necessarily. We're not going to get into that granular detail, but just kind of an idea of how much it would cost to start up the task force and then keep it running on an annual basis. So in putting this presentation together, I'm going to afford you with a great deal of flexibility in terms of how you want to do it. The way in which most people do it is they'll use a narrated PowerPoint. And so they'll just record themselves going through their PowerPoint slides and kind of do a narrated PowerPoint. Whenever I do these types of things, I like to use Zoom actually. And I'll just start a Zoom session and kind of the way in which we do with our class sessions, share my slides, and then I'll just go through a presentation of the information on those slides. So you can certainly do it that way. If you're familiar with other types of programs such as Prezi, Screencast-O-Matic, using Vimeo, any of those, you can use anything that you are comfortable using. I typically see people usually do a narrated PowerPoint because that's something you have access to, and that's something that is usually relatively quick and easy to do. But in terms of the presentation and the length of the presentation, my recommendation is really try and keep it short. Because again, think about this as being one item on a very long agenda. And probably when you give your presentation, if you're doing this in real life, you would then have questions coming from council members or supervisors. But keep it maybe 5 to 10 minutes, I think would be very reasonable. Once you go beyond 10 minutes, then you might start losing people's interest. And so about 5 to 10 minutes, keep it as concise and tight as you can. And I think that will then work well for the presentation. The presentation will be submitted the same way that you submitted your paper. And so I've got a Dropbox, a link there on our Canvas site. If it's a 5 to 10 minute presentation, that should be a small enough file that you can attach it. It'll upload relatively easily. I'll be able to download it and watch it and then evaluate the presentation. Once you get longer presentations, sometimes Canvas gets a little finicky about allowing those longer files to be uploaded, and sometimes they'll require you to do it through a OneDrive or something like that. But as long as it's 5 to 10 minutes, I think that's certainly going to be short enough to certainly get the job done. So that's what we're calling this multimedia presentation assignment. And again, this is an unusual assignment because it provides you with a lot of flexibility. It's kind of unconventional, but I think it's a good way to kind of get you thinking creatively about not only how to solve problems in the public sector, but also touching upon the information we're going to talk about tonight in terms of collaborative efforts to deliver services to the public. And so I think it just kind of gives you this interesting way to address a problem as opposed to just writing out a traditional type of term paper. So that's the assignment. It is due on October 6th, I believe. Let me scroll down here. Yes, due the end of week 6 on October 6th by midnight. So you've got a couple of weeks to work on this. At this point, are there any additional preliminary questions about this multimedia assignment? I'm sure as you start working on it, if you haven't been working on it already, as you start working on it, if there are questions that emerge, you can ask me those questions in class next week, or as always, you can send me an email, and I am happy to respond to any of those questions. I hope you kind of enjoy the assignment because it is something that is different than what you'll be doing in a lot of your other courses. And also, it's important for us because as an MPA program, one of those core competencies that we need to have in an MPA program is the ability to communicate effectively with diverse audiences in culturally responsive ways. And that's kind of the NASPA language in terms of that competency. So it's important that we have some type of assessment vehicle here early on in the program to kind of assess your abilities to do that type of communication. Then the other assignment I'd like to present to you tonight, if you haven't looked at it yet, I'm sorry, I should say, can you please name the applications we can use to narrate? Oh, sure. Usually, most people use narrated PowerPoint, but there's what's called Prezi, Screencast-O-Matic, Vimeo. Those are just 3 that I've used in the past. I've seen students use in the past. If you've used any of those before, they're relatively easy to use, but if you haven't used them before, I think a narrated PowerPoint is probably the simplest way to do it, just because it's something that, we've all used PowerPoint before, and so it's usually a little bit more familiar to us than some of those other programs. Absolutely. Okay, let me share out, if I have it here, which I think I do, what we're calling our final assessment. And let me walk you through the final assessment. Now, this final assessment is due at the end of our semester together. So I think technically our course ends on October 18th, even though we have classes on Monday nights. It officially ends on that Friday, October 18th. So that's when I'm having this final assessment due. So you've got a good bit of time to think about and work on this final assessment. Some of the information on the final assessment we haven't gotten to yet in class. And so some of these you may not feel comfortable to start working on now, but you've got some time to work on it. The idea behind this final assessment is that I don't like examinations in graduate level courses, especially public administration courses. I think we talked about this on our first night together. We went over the syllabus because it's relatively unusual for you to have to do a traditional examination in your job. Now, obviously, if you're applying for a promotion or a different type of position that requires an exam, that's kind of a different story. But on a daily basis, we don't do examinations. But on a daily basis, we do have to take information that we know and apply that information appropriately to fit the context of those situations that we are facing. And that's what this assessment is designed to allow you the opportunity to do. So in this final assessment, it consists of 5 different scenarios. And so I prepared 5 scenarios for you. They're original scenarios. They're relatively brief. I don't want to inundate you with a lot of superfluous information. I kind of give you the information that you need in order to then take the information we've covered in the class and then apply that information appropriately to address that scenario. So there are 5 somewhat realistic public affairs scenarios. And then there are 2 questions related to each of those scenarios. So a grand total of 10 questions on this final assessment. Each one of those questions worth 10 points for a total of 100 points. It's just a lot easier if these things are graded out of 100 points. It's just a little bit more intuitive than if they had a different point value. So let's walk through some of these. And I should preface it by saying this is an assessment device. And so as an assessment device, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to see how well you can take the information that we have covered in class, that are covered in the classics articles, that was covered in the Kettle textbook. How well can you take that information and then apply it appropriately to a realistic scenario in the public sector? So as such, it means that there are no right or wrong answers on the final assessment. Your answers will be judged based upon how well you justify your answer, how well you can justify that, yes, this answer is the most appropriate answer for this given scenario. So, don't be looking for the best answer. Look for the answer that is the most appropriate for the scenario. Again, going back to my favorite answer, it depends upon the context. Also, another point to remember is that since it's an assessment device, this is not a research assignment. So I'm not asking you to go out there and, pull a bunch of research and draw upon the research. I'm asking you to take the information from the class and apply that information. Now, there may be some situations when you are responding to these questions where you might want to use some information from beyond the class. That's absolutely fine. And if so, cite that information. But for the most part, the vast majority of the information you're going to use is what's going to come from our class sessions. So scenario number 1, the city of Preble Heights, which is a fictional city, is a working class neighborhood just outside of Indianapolis, Indiana. The city council has recently embarked upon a debate regarding the rehabilitation of the deteriorating recreation center on the outskirts of town. The recreation center has been closed for 6 months pending some major renovations to ensure safety of patrons. The council is split. 2 members would like to have the city spearhead the renovations. 2 members would like to turn the renovation project completely over to a private sector contractor who has a reputation for getting projects done quickly. The city manager presents a study that shows turning over the renovation to a private contractor would mean that the recreation center would be renovated 3 months ahead of schedule and would cost 20% less than if the project was managed by the city. So this is a fictional city in Indiana. So just assume that not all the same competitive bidding requirements that we have here in California apply in this situation. So this is basically a situation where the city council can engage in negotiated bidding with one contractor. There's one contractor they're familiar with, and so the city manager has gotten the cost proposal from that one contractor, and those cost proposals 20% less than if the city managed the project, and that this contractor can actually bring the project in 3 months ahead of schedule, as opposed to the schedule if the city did it. So you've got 2 members of city council who are in favor of having the city do the whole thing, 2 members of city council who are in favor of working with this contractor, turning the whole project over to the contractor. And then you have a 5th city council member who is undecided, and they are looking for some more guidance in order to make their determination. Question 1A, discuss some of the reasons why the private contractor may be able to complete the project quicker and for less money than the city. So this is the information we talked about differences between public and private administration. We talked about Graham Allison and kind of the differences in how things are done in the public versus private sector. You're going to draw upon that information to answer question 1A. So why can the private contractor do it quicker and for less money? Then in question 1B, discuss some of the disadvantages of turning the project completely over to a private entity. So if the city is having nothing else to do with it, just giving it to the private entity, what are some of the disadvantages that come along with just turning the project over to a private sector corporation? So this all draws on that public-private distinction discussion that we had in class, I guess a couple of weeks ago. Then we have scenario number 2. As discussed in class, there is still some controversy regarding public administration as a discipline. And if you remember in a previous class session, we talked about the discipline of public administration. We talked about what kind of makes public administration a discipline or a field of study, how unique public administration is in terms of the methodologies that we use and the phenomena that we study. Some feel that public administration is its own academic discipline, while others argue that it lacks the requirements of an academic discipline and is actually a subfield of political science. I think I shared with you in that previous class session that in the PhD program I was in, my program considered public administration to just be one of many subfields of political science. So when I took my qualifying exams, public administration was one of my 4 subfields. My other subfields were Congress, presidency, and state and urban government. So some people say it's a subfield, some say it's its own academic discipline. Let me get rid of something on my screen. There we go. This debate can also be seen in the location of MPA programs across the country. Now here at Northridge, you kind of an interesting arrangement in that the MPA program is run out of extended ed, so it's run out of the Seng College. But in a lot of other places around the country, MPA programs exist within political science departments. And every year I go and do site visits for NASPA. The vast majority of the programs I go and look at are in political science departments. And I just did a study for an article about a year or so ago. And I looked at the location of MPA programs, and I think it was 46% of MPA programs are located within a department of political science. And then the remaining 54% kind of have different types of arrangements, but that's certainly the plurality are located within political science departments. However, some MPA programs are housed in the College of Business. When I was at Ohio State, at that time, the MPA program was within the College of Business. And so we were kind of the ugly stepchild, as my professor would always say, of the College of Business. You would always, the public sector economics professor would always point out that if you look in the faculty parking lot, you would see all the BMWs and the Mercedes that were driven by the business faculty. And then they were parked next to his AMC Pacer, if you know what that is from years ago, his AMC Pacer. And you can kind of tell if they taught business or public administration based upon the type of car that they drove. So in some places, it was in a College of Business. Now at Ohio State, it's no longer like that, but that's how it was back in the day when I was there. Other MPA programs tend to maintain a standalone status in that they are their own department. They operate independently of any other academic disciplines. At Cal State Long Beach, the MPA program is its own department. It is not only separate from the Department of Political Science, it's in a completely different college than the Department of Political Science. So in question 2A, discuss the field of administration as an academic discipline. What elements of the study of public administration make it a discipline? What elements argue against public administration as a discipline? So what makes it a discipline? On the flip side of the coin, what would make you think it is not an academic discipline and it is instead just a subfield of a bigger discipline like political science? And that's a really important point to discuss here in the early stages of an MPA program. So in this course oftentimes prepares you for future courses in the MPA program. And so it's important for us to have a really good sense of the quote unquote discipline of public administration at this point in your studies. Then in 2B, whether a discipline or not, the field of public administration has always struggled with the perception and reality of a politics administration dichotomy. We talked about this politics administration dichotomy in Woodrow Wilson a few sessions ago. We know that this politics administration dichotomy was kind of the heart of the study of public administration in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Originally presented by Woodrow Wilson in 1887, the politics administration dichotomy debate has been a central theme in the field of public administration for many decades. Discuss the politics administration dichotomy and its impact on how we study and engage in public administration. And we kind of had this discussion about on the political side, doing the policy formulation types of things, on the administrative side, doing the policy execution types of things, and how, we used to think of those being separate. Now we understand that we have public administrators involved in both sides of the equation. So kind of talk about that whole idea of the politics administration dichotomy, what has happened to it in recent years, and how it impacts how we study public administration. And I won't say any more about that because I feel like I'm starting to get into an answer, so I won't do that to you. I'll let you give me your answer to that question. Let's see. The question is, are these questions we're looking at the questions that we'll find on our final assignment? Are these just examples? No, these are the actual ones. So these are the actual questions that you'll be answering on the final assessment. The final assessment is something that you can start working on anytime that you want, and then you'll have to turn it in no later than October 18th. But the final is not something we're going to do in a timed environment. It's something you can work at your leisure. You can use any of the information from the class, whether it be textbooks or recordings from our class sessions, any information that you need in order to answer the questions. Because again, I think that better reflects what we typically do on a daily basis in public administration, as opposed to memorizing and then just, for lack of a better term, regurgitating information on an exam. So this is the real deal. Scenario number 3. The Department of Aging in the state of confusion is in crisis. The governor appointed Perry Lemon as the director of the department 6 months ago. Lemon is an ardent partisan with no experience in issues of aging and no discernible leadership or management skills. Lemon's incompetence has only added to a toxic organization culture where there is little trust between employees and outright warfare between units over scarce resources. It is not uncommon for one unit to sabotage another unit, and there is little indication that units know or care about the mission of the organization. This toxic culture has resulted in several externalities or unintended consequences. Retention is at an all-time low. Employees are leaving the organization so quickly that human resources cannot replace them with new employees. The onboarding process consists of a 10-minute video explaining the organization's purpose and little else. The organization has become fixated on applying rules and regulations with little regard for serving citizens. It has gotten so bad that the state legislature has lost confidence in the department, which has led to a further reduction in the organization's appropriations. And this is kind of that tautological type of situation we see in the public sector, where when you have dysfunctional public organizations, they then tend to lose the faith and the trust of those budget makers, which then leads those budget makers to reduce the appropriations, which in turn then leaves less resources for those agencies to kind of heal themselves. And then they kind of begin this downward death spiral, if you will. And so it's kind of that tautological type of reasoning that we see sometimes in the public sector. And that's kind of what this organization is currently going through. Question 3A, select 2 classical organization theorists or theories that you feel would benefit the organization. Discuss these theories and why they would be beneficial. Now, we haven't gotten to this information yet in this class. We will get to this information certainly next week. And I think this information will kind of be the mainstay of what we talk about in class next week, approaches to studying organizations. And I'll present you with an evolution of the public administration literature focusing on public organizations and how we have viewed public organizations differently over the past 150 years. And the first theories that we'll talk about next week are going to be our classical theories. If you've taken undergraduate public administration, you're aware of some of those classical theories, things like Max Weber and his ideal bureaucracy, people like Frederick Taylor and his scientific management, Henri Fail, people like Luther Gulick. Those are kind of what we consider to be the classical types of theorists. Then in 2B, you'll select two neoclassical theorists that you feel would be beneficial and discuss why they would be beneficial. The definition for us in this class of neoclassical organization theory will be any of the theories that we talk about next week that come after the classical school. So any of those theories that come after the principal school and Luther Gulick in the 1930s. So theories such as human relations theory, human resource management theory, systems theory, which we're actually going to talk about tonight in our discussion of the environment of public administration, organization culture theory. Those are what we consider to be the neoclassical theories because they come after the classical school and they were developed as a response or a rejoinder to the flaws and criticisms of the classical school. So two classical theories and two neoclassical theories. And again, all that is information that you will have at the end of class next week. So number 3, you'll be able to start working on after next week. Numbers 1 and 2, we've covered that information already, so you can certainly start working on that anytime that you would like. So scenario number 4, we're going to return back to the good old city of Preble Heights. The city of Preble Heights also has a unit known as the Economic Revitalization Department, otherwise known as ERD. ERD's primary task is to implement a policy known as the Urban Revitalization Initiative. The initiative provides cash grants to businesses who renovate their facilities and remain in urban areas as opposed to moving to other states. The primary beneficiaries of these grants are obviously business owners who are willing to stay where they are and continue to contribute to economic growth in urban areas of the city, primarily the downtown area. To be successful, the policy would need to provide enough grant money to offset the cost savings of potentially moving to other states and areas. Not all members of ERD are in favor of the policy goals and believe that it is not the role of government to influence business decisions. These employees have sometimes been accused of slow-walking grant applications to delay the payment of money to applicants. 4A, from an accountability perspective, what type of accountability does this slow walking reflect and why? So we're going to draw upon our accountability and ethics discussion. And then in 4B, consider the stakeholders involved in this policy. Who are the stakeholders and what are their vested interests in the successful or even unsuccessful implementation of this policy? Tonight, as we talk about the environment of public administration, we'll spend a few minutes talking about different types of stakeholders and how to identify the vested interests of those relevant stakeholders. So you'll get that type of information to answer 4B after class tonight. So by the time of end of class tonight, you'll have all the information you need to then answer scenario number 4. So 1, 2, and 4, you're able to answer whenever you want to. 3, you're going to have to wait until what we talk about next week. And then for scenario number 5, you're going to have to wait as well because this is information that we're going to get into probably in week number 7. So in a couple more weeks. We're back to the city of Preble Heights again. Nothing if not consistent. City of Preble Heights is struggling with its budget. It uses a simple line item budget and typically increases expenditures each year in connection with increases in gross domestic product rates. Over the past 5 years, the city failed to complete its budget on time and struggled to balance revenues and expenditures. The city auditor found that many programs are inefficient and are not achieving their goals and objectives, so they're inefficient as well as being ineffective. Standard & Poor's and Moody's, and those are two credit rating agencies, if you're not familiar with them, what they will do is they will issue ratings to cities based upon their credit worthiness. And so what these credit rating agencies will do is whenever a city wants to go out there and borrow money, they want to issue a bond and borrow money to do something, that bond would then have to be rated by one of these credit rating agencies. These credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's and Moody's, and those are two of the major ones. Another one is Fitch's, but these are the two primary ones. They both reduce the city's credit rating due to its budget issues. As a city council member, you and your colleagues need to recommend a new budgeting format to try and alleviate these concerns. So in 5A, select and recommend a new budget format for the city that will address the concerns in this scenario. In week number 7, our topic is going to be leading and managing public organizations. And as we talk about leading and managing public organizations, we'll talk about how we manage personnel as well as how we manage budgets. When we talk about how we manage budgets, we'll present different budget formats, how they work, their advantages and their disadvantages. Based upon that discussion, you'll then select one of those, and I'll present to you 4 different budget formats. Select one of those 4 budget formats that you think would help the city address the concerns that are specified here in this scenario. And then in 5B, I'm going to give you kind of a sub-scenario here. The city's aquatic center needs renovation. Given the city's fiscal problems, it is clear that the city lacks the resources to complete the project without borrowing money. So they're going to have to issue a bond in order to pay for these renovations. The aquatic center is open to citizens for lap swimming Monday through Saturday from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. Citizens pay a flat $3 fee to use the facility each time that they use it, and 100 residents use the facility for lap swimming 200 days out of the year. So you can kind of see the type of revenue that the aquatic center is getting from lap swimming. The city also charges a $20,000 per year fee to the school district and club teams, swim clubs, to use the facility for practices. A total of 6 teams pay this fee. So you have $120,000 coming in from these fees from these teams and schools that are using the facility. The operating expenses for the aquatic center amount to $180,000 per year. Since the city does not have the money to pay for the renovations, it proposes a bond to borrow money to cover the costs. What type of bond would you recommend and why? Again, in week 7, as we talk about managing financial resources, we will talk about borrowing money and how governments borrow money and the impact of that on how we can administer our programs. And I'll introduce you to a few different types of bonds that governments oftentimes use, their advantages and their disadvantages. You'll be using that information then to recommend one of those types of bonds then in 5B. So this scenario 5 will become much clearer when we get to week 7 and cover that information about how we manage fiscal resources in public organizations. So number 5, you're going to have to hold off on doing as well. But those are the 5 scenarios, the total of 10 questions. I will say that you know that I really do believe in parsimony, as I've told you probably ad nauseum so far in this course. And so you can be very parsimonious, very concise with your answers. I think 1 to 2 paragraphs for each one of these questions is certainly enough to suffice. And when you look at the questions themselves, you can kind of see that probably a paragraph or 2 would work. So, for instance, you've got in 5A, where you're selecting a new budget format. So if you say performance-based budget would be the most appropriate budget format to use, this is why it would be the most appropriate format to use and more appropriate than any of the other formats. That's a paragraph. And that's good enough to then get that answer done for 5A. So 1 to 2 paragraphs for each one of those questions. And I always took a little bit of time going through these scenarios, but I think it's important that we all know exactly what's going on in the final assessment, so you kind of have a bit of a foreshadowing of it, so that when you sit down and actually start working on it, you kind of know my expectations and you know the types of things that you'll need to do to successfully complete the final assessment. So we're putting some time in now, investing some time now, but it will certainly pay dividends at the end of the semester. So any questions, preliminary questions on the final assessment? As always, as you do begin working on it, any questions other than what's the right answer, but any other questions, I'm certainly open to answering. So just send me an email and I'm happy to respond to any questions. Okay, those are basically our housekeeping issues. Just one other quick reminder, which you are all very well aware of. You have another Canvas essay that's coming due next week. The Canvas essays so far have been very, very good. And for the most part, they've been all pretty much full credit. So just keep doing what you've been doing on those Canvas essays. In this Canvas essay number 5, you'll be drawing upon information that we're talking about tonight in terms of the environment of public administration. So I'm asking you to do in Canvas essay number 5 is to select a public or nonprofit organization and then discuss the environment in which that organization operates. So discuss things such as who are the primary stakeholders for that organization in that environment, things such as what types of collaborative efforts and partnerships do you see that organization engaging in within that environment? It's just kind of a general assessment of how well the environment is able to support the operations of the organization. We know that organizations can only be successful if they have adequate support from their surrounding environment. So support in terms of a labor pool they can rely upon, in terms of money that they can get from appropriations or grants that they can use to then do their business, political support, citizen support, those types of things. So how well does the environment support the organization? So as always, you'll be responding to that prompt and by Thursday, and then you'll provide answers or responses to two of your classmates after that. Okay. All righty. Let's get into our information for tonight, which is the environment of public administration. And I think a lot of these issues within the context of the environment we have discussed before, and we've kind of touched upon them in previous class sessions. So some of this information we'll probably be able to cover relatively quickly because it's kind of a rehash of some things that we've done before. But there's a large body of literature in public administration that really believes that in order to understand why public organizations look the way in which they do, why they operate the way in which they do, why public administrators behave the way in which they do, in order to understand that, you have to understand the environment that surrounds that organization and those administrators. So there's a very old theory in public administration known as the ecology of public administration. And it comes from John Gauss. And John Gauss is probably best known for challenging the politics administration dichotomy back in the 1930s, as we had talked about in a previous class. He's also very well known for advocating for the establishment of a professional organization for public administration, the American Society for Public Administration. And he was very much an advocate for a separate study, a separate discipline of public administration. He argues that in order to understand public administration, we have to understand the ecology of public administration. So he makes the argument that if you think about an organization like you would think about a plant, that plants will grow and thrive based upon the influences they get from their environment, the amount of water they get, the amount of sunlight they get, the amount of fertilizer they get. Sometimes people say the amount of time that they're talked to. I don't know if that's true, but some people will say that. You have to look at the characteristics of the environment in order to understand how and why that plant is maturing in the way in which it's maturing. Gauss argues it's the same type of thing with public organizations. We have to understand their ecology. We have to understand their environment. As we go through our discussion tonight, it will become clear what some of those environmental influences are. As I had said before, providing an adequate labor pool, providing resources, the support of primary and secondary and tertiary stakeholders within our environment, the support of elected officials from the environment. Those are all those kind of environmental influences. Sometimes the competition that organizations face from other organizations or from the private or from the nonprofit sector. On the flip side of the coin, some of the influences could be the collaborative efforts and the collaborative opportunities that organizations enjoy with other organizations within this general environment. And that's a topic that we'll talk about when we talk about governing networks in a few minutes. So to understand an organization, we need to look at its environment, and we need to understand that an organization is part of that environment. It's part of a larger system. And the 1960s and 70s, we had this organization theory that really formed known as systems theory. And systems theory argued that we have to study organizations as part of a larger system, as part of a whole. If we try and study an organization in isolation, then we're going to miss the entire context of why that organization even exists to begin with. So systems theory told us that essentially there are a couple of different approaches to the ways in which we could study public organizations. The first approach was the natural or closed system approach. And scholars will kind of sometimes use those terms interchangeably, the natural, the closed system. In the natural or closed system approach, we kind of do what John Gauss had done in terms of looking at organizations kind of as living organisms. And so not to depress you too much, but as you look at them as living organisms, from the moment that these organizations are created, like a living organism, they then dissipate energy into their environment until essentially they will end up going out of existence. The ultimate goal of these organizations is going to be the same as the ultimate goal of a living organism, which is survival. So organizations are geared toward agency survival. So if you want to explain their behaviors and their actions, most of their, if not all of their behaviors and actions are geared toward helping the organization survive into the future. The way in which an organization can survive in the future is by finding a balance, what the natural closed systems theorists refer to as their point of homeostasis. So that's your first 25-cent word for tonight. They all search for this homeostasis, this balance. And in the natural closed systems theory, the balance that they are looking at is the balance within the organization. So organizations are well balanced. They have organizational harmony when everything is working in a symbiotic relationship, kind of like the human body. So the human body is in balance when you have blood pressure that's normal and all those good things. That's considered to be your point of homeostasis. That's what organizations strive for as well. This balance, this point of homeostasis. The problem for organizations, though, is that as they age, they end up dissipating energy and resources into the external environment. So they lose these resources as they age. And for the natural closed systems theorists, it's very much of a one-way street, in that these resources leave the organization, go into the external environment, and they never really come back to the organization. So if you've got an organization that is dissipating energy and resources, eventually it will dissipate enough resources that no longer has adequate resources to survive. And it's at that point in time, according to these theorists, that agencies, organizations will go out of existence. So kind of like when the human body breaks down and a human being dies, organizations kind of go through that same type of entropy process. You can contrast that natural closed systems approach to open systems theorists. And so open systems theorists are people like Katz and Kahn, and we'll talk a little bit more about this next week, but people like Katz and Kahn. And Katz and Kahn make the argument in open systems theory that the focus should not be closed. It should not be just internal to the organization, but rather our focus should be on the relationship between the organization and its surrounding environment. So much like closed systems theorists, open systems theorists say that organizations are struggling to find this balance, this point of homeostasis. But for open systems theorists, this point of homeostasis, this balance, is the balance between the organization and its external environment. So organizations need to have the support of their external environment, and organizations can then also support their external environment as well. It kind of becomes this two-way street between the organization and its environment. Yes, as organizations age, they will dissipate energy and resources into their environment. But at the same time, they can also then import new energy and new resources back into the organization. That is this theory known as negative entropy. So it's not just a one-way street. They can also get these resources from their external environment. Most public and nonprofit organizations are going to operate in an open system. It's relatively unusual to find an organization that does not operate within an open environment. Let's see, Micah said, if that happens when an organization fades out, the organization still has funds. What happens to those funds? What will happen is if you have an organization that goes out of existence, any of those unspent appropriations, they'll probably be spent before the organization goes out of existence. And so probably the organization will spend up all of its budget for that fiscal year. But then for the next fiscal year, those appropriations that would normally go to that organization, they'll then go to some other priority of Congress or some other priority of a state legislature. And one of the things that we know in the public sector is one of the reasons why we sometimes have these inefficiencies is that we budget at the federal level, as well as the vast majority of our states, on an annual fiscal year basis. And so you get appropriations for a fiscal year. So organizations will then have an incentive to spend up all their appropriations, spend up all their money before the end of the fiscal year. If you don't spend all your money by the end of the fiscal year, then the appropriators are going to look at it and say, well, you didn't spend all your money in this past fiscal year. You didn't need all that money. So we're going to give you less appropriations in the next fiscal year. So there's an incentive to go ahead and spend that money. That's why we have all those stories in the fleecing of America about things like the Department of Defense that would be out there buying $600 toilet seats. I'm sure they're wonderful toilet seats, but toilet seats usually don't cost $600, especially in the Department of Defense. But they're trying to find a way to spend that money so they don't end up losing that money. I know in the Cal States, that's kind of something that departments struggle with in most Cal State campuses, is that if you have money left over at the end of the fiscal year, a lot of that money is going to end up being swept. And I know with my budget, it ends up getting swept by either the college or by academic affairs at the university level. And so we really have an incentive to try and spend that money. And so you just don't want to lose those appropriations. But typically, organizations will use up the money and then they will, once they go out of existence, and that money's available for something else. And yeah, that same as Olga says in the county, that same in a lot of cities as well. And so that kind of leads to some of those inefficiencies that we are troubled by in terms of the public sector. So you've got these organizations that are operating within this environment, but they can reinvigorate themselves, if you will. So they don't necessarily always decay and go out of existence. They can reinvigorate themselves by bringing in new energies and new resources from their external environment. Your next 25-cent word of the night is this word of equifinality. Equifinality in open systems theory regards the idea that there are multiple paths that organizations can take to arrive at their point of homeostasis. There are multiple paths that organizations can take to find this perfect balance between the organization and its external environment. Some organizations will find this balance by appeasing elected officials. And so that will get them more appropriations and develop more trust with elected officials. Some organizations will find their balance through collaborative networks and by working with other organizations so that you can leverage the resources of other organizations, perhaps put together a united front that you can then present to a state legislature or to Congress to try and get funded for whatever you want to get funded for. So there are a lot of different paths that organizations can follow to find this balance between themselves and their environment. And that's what's known as equifinality, multiple paths to this steady state, to this state of homeostasis. What natural, closed, and open systems theory share is they share this recognition that not only are organizations part of a bigger system, they're part of a whole, but that system lacks permanent existence. These systems are transient, they are dynamic, they shift, sometimes on a yearly basis, a monthly basis, sometimes on a daily or even hourly basis. These are not static relationships, they are very dynamic relationships. Systems can not only change, systems can go out of existence as well, and then be replaced by different systems. My classic example, I think I may have mentioned this too in another context in a previous class session, was the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, the United States ACIR. The ACIR is an example of an organization that went out of existence in 1996. And the purpose of the ACIR was to do studies on intergovernmental relations. So they would contract with scholars around the country to do research into various aspects of intergovernmental relations. I had a contract with them just before they went out of existence in 1996, looking at the Americans with Disabilities Act and looking at the impacts of the Americans with Disabilities Act on local school districts. And that became part of their draft report that actually led to their demise. Not my fault, but I guess I had a little hand in it. But what had happened is ACIR adopted this draft report, and this draft report actually called for turning a lot of these policies back over to state and local governments, telling Congress that, some of these aspects of the Americans with Disabilities Act, some of those should be turned back over to state and local governments. And they had a whole list of different laws, different policies that would be improved by turning functions back over to state and local governments. That draft report then got leaked to Congress before it was actually approved by the commissioners. Congress obviously did not like that those findings. And so Congress then decided to defund the advisory commission. So in fiscal year 1996, they did what we call zeroed them out. They gave them an appropriation of exactly $0.00. Once you get zeroed out, you then don't have money to pay for these contracts. You don't have money to pay for your offices that you are leasing, for your staff. And so the organization goes out of existence. One can argue that ACIR went out of existence because it wasn't able to find its point of homeostasis with members of Congress. It lost the trust of members of Congress. When it lost the trust, it lost its appropriations. So it went out of existence, and then those appropriations that used to go to the ACIR then were redirected to other federal organizations. So those systems can certainly change. So that system went out of existence once ACIR was gone. Nothing has come by in the recent years to replace the ACIR. We've never developed a new ACIR. We don't have any corollary agency to it. It just kind of has left a void in the environment. And so it completely and fundamentally changed that system of relationships. So I like systems theory because it gets, especially open systems theory, because it gets us looking beyond organizations and looking at the environment that surrounds those organizations and the relationship between the organization and its environment. And we'll talk more about systems theory when we get to our discussion of organization theories next week. But that's what we consider to be systems theory. And again, it fits in really well here with our discussion of the external environment of organizations. So when we look at this system, when we look at this external environment, we know that in the public sector, our environments are more political than in the private sector, and they're also much more varied than they are in the private sector. In public environments, we have a lot of more different folks. We have different organizations, different stakeholders. These stakeholders all have a different vested interest than each other, and much more variety in those vested interests than what you might see in the environment for a private organization. So it's important in understanding our environment to understand our stakeholders. If you have taken a public policy course in the past, I'm sure you spent a lot of time talking about who stakeholders are, how to identify stakeholders, how to balance one stakeholder against another. You've probably done a lot of this discussion before, but just for our limited purposes tonight, it's important to note that stakeholders are those individuals and groups in our environment that have a vested interest in what we are doing as an organization. They have a vested interest in the success or sometimes failure of an organization. They have a vested interest in public policies and public programs and their success or their failure. Not all stakeholders are created equal. We have some stakeholders that we consider to be the primary stakeholders. Primary stakeholders are the ones who get the most direct, immediate benefit from what the organization is doing, from the programs that the organization is implementing. So you think about program beneficiaries, you think about an income subsidy program. So you've got an income subsidy program such as a general assistance program. Not a lot of states still have general assistance programs, although we're starting to see them revived at the local level. They're not being called general assistance, but they're being called income sustainability programs, sometimes basic income programs. But years ago, states used to administer these general assistance programs. General assistance programs are direct cash transfers of money directly to income eligible households. Those income eligible households are your primary stakeholders because they are receiving those benefits directly. But for that income subsidy program, you also have secondary stakeholders as well. These are groups and people who are receiving indirect benefit. So they're not necessarily getting the benefit, but there's a benefit that accrues to them because of the existence of this program. So you think about something like the implementers of that general assistance program. There are public administrators who will implement that program in terms of through indirect as well as direct administration. Their jobs exist because of this general assistance program. This is what they do on a daily basis. So they also get a benefit from it. They're not getting the money, but they are getting their jobs because of this program. So they're kind of your secondary line of stakeholders. So anyone who gets a benefit or more indirect benefit will probably fall into that secondary stakeholder type of category. Then you also have tertiary stakeholders. Tertiary stakeholders get a more distant benefit. So these could be, for example, if you have a childhood immunization program, the childhood immunization program will provide low cost or no cost immunizations to children of income eligible families. Those are your primary beneficiaries. Then the emergency rooms of hospitals will be a secondary beneficiary because if there are more immunizations, then in theory, there'll be less diseases. Less diseases mean less people going to emergency rooms. And so it really kind of lightens the load of these emergency rooms. So those emergency rooms and people working those emergency rooms will be the secondary types of beneficiaries. But then your tertiary beneficiaries, the more distant ones, are your other community members. So people who don't work in emergency rooms, people who don't get these immunization programs directly, they're just people who live in the community. If these immunization programs reduce the instance of illness, then it's less likely other people will get these contagious diseases. And so therefore they are going to draw an indirect tertiary type of benefit because of those positive types of externalities. Now, in identifying stakeholders, what makes it difficult is this existence of these externalities, these spillovers. The more externalities and spillovers that you have from a public policy or a public program, the more likely it is that you're going to have a lot of these tertiary types of stakeholders. So when you think about the childhood immunization program, it's a positive spillover. It's a positive externality that there's less likelihood that those folks are going to get sick in the community. So they're experiencing a positive type of consequence. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that. Let's see, in text chat, we have in the basic income scenario, would the landlord of a tenant receiving basic income payments be considered secondary or tertiary? That's a great question. I would probably put them in the secondary category because they are getting an indirect benefit, but it's a real benefit in that those families who are living in those properties, if they're getting this additional income assistance, that's going to give them more wherewithal to be able to pay their rent, which means there's more likelihood that the landlord will get the rent paid. So it's a great question. I think I would put them in the secondary level of beneficiaries. So when we have these spillovers, it means we're going to have a more difficult time in identifying who really benefits from these programs and what they wanted to try and get out of these programs. We know we have positive externalities like that immunization program, like that income subsidy program or the basic income program. We also know about negative externalities, as we've talked about before, with things like pollution. With something like pollution, it's a negative externality, it's a spillover. But the problem with that negative externality is that there's no really an inducement for the company to create less of that product that's resulting in that pollution. Companies will make their supply and demand decisions based upon sales. Well, if someone is experiencing a negative externality, that's not going to appear in their sales numbers. And so for goods and services that produce negative externalities, those are the goods and services that tend to be overproduced. For goods and services that provide positive externalities, those are the ones that tend to be underproduced. And they're underproduced because we are not taking all these positive good things into account because those people are free riders. Those people who are getting these benefits are not directly participating in the program. So we oftentimes have trouble identifying who they are and how much they are getting in terms of these benefits. So identifying your stakeholders in your environment can be very difficult when you're dealing with a program or policy that results in a lot of these negative or positive externalities. We're not going to talk through this next slide, but this next slide is kind of provided to give you some examples of the motivation of different stakeholders for different types of policies and programs. So for economic policies or social change, work-related programs, environmental programs, health programs, safety and security programs, mental health programs, just some examples of some of the stakeholders and some of the benefits that those stakeholders may get from those types of specific policies and programs. So it's important for us when we're understanding our environment to understand who our stakeholders are, to understand what level of stakeholder they exist at, and to understand what types of tangible and intangible benefits that they're actually getting from these policies and these programs. That, again, getting back to systems theory, That will allow us to better identify this point of homeostasis and this proper balance with our external environment. So when we're looking at the environment of a public organization, we look at the stakeholders, but we also have to look at collaborative efforts between public organizations, because that's all part of our external environment. And there has been a major emphasis in the literature of late to look at these things known as collaborative governance networks, looking at how agencies and organizations collaborate together in order to deliver these services and these goods. There's an article we'll talk about in just a second, the Agranoff article in the classics textbook, that I think really kind of encapsulate a lot of the lessons that we have learned from all these studies looking at these networks and these collaborative efforts between public organizations. But before we get to the Agranoff article, I think it's also important for us to understand how these networks come into being and then how these networks kind of develop and mature over time. So to have a network, a collaborative association between public or between public and nonprofit or public and private organizations, that collaboration must pay dividends. That collaboration must provide benefits, or else it's not worth the effort for public organizations to get involved in these collaborative networks. When they determined that, yes, working with other agencies and entities will deliver positive benefits to our organization or to our constituents, they decide to join into these collaborative networks. There is a life cycle that these networks tend to go through. The first stage of the life cycle of a network tends to be the formation stage. This is when the agencies decide to come together into a collaborative network. They have to define their missions. They have to define who the participants, the participating organizations will be. They have to determine what employees in those organizations will participate in these types of networks. And they oftentimes have to drop governing documents that will govern the different roles of the organizations and what they are doing and how they relate with each other. Now, not all networks of organizations will have governing documents, but as Agranoff tells us in his article, even though these networks are considered usually to be non-hierarchical, they still typically operate in a similar way to an organization in that they need to draw up these types of governing documents to govern the relationship between the different organizations. So they go through this formation phase. Once they have developed their mission, their purpose, they know who's involved, they know they have the documents that bring this network into existence. Then they move into the second phase, which is the developmental phase. In the developmental phase of a network, that's where you're building your capacity as a network. You're encouraging new members to join this collaborative network if necessary. You work on developing trust between the members of this collaborative network, and you clarify the roles, the leadership roles in this network. Some organizations are going to take naturally the lead in this network. Some will kind of take a secondary type of role, but you really need to clarify, who's in charge of this network, who's leading this network, who's kind of following in this network as well. The next phase they go through is the fostering of sustainability. This is where they build an ongoing capacity for this network to continue into the future, and they work at combating interruptions. When you think about organizations joining together into a collaborative network, this is one thing among many other things that that organization is doing. So there are a lot of moving parts going on in this organization. Working in this collaborative network is just one of them. And as Agranoff will tell us in his article, when he reviewed these, he reviewed 14 different governing networks. And what he found is that leaders in these networks would say that only about 15 to 20% of their time was spent working within these collaborative networks. That the vast majority of their time, 80 to 85% of the rest of their time, was spent doing the other work of that given organization. So it's important to combat against interruptions where the everyday work of the organization will interrupt the collaborative efforts of the network, because it's one additional thing that organizations are doing. So not only are different or are networks different from each other, but they also go through this kind of life cycle, this maturation process. And when we study these networks, we have to understand what stage of development these networks are in. Are they in the formation stage, the developmental stage, or are they in the fostering sustainability stage? We always in the literature tend to extol the virtues of collaboration. And we talk about how important it is to have these governing types of networks and how unusual it is today to have a program administered by one singular agency. And most programs and policies are being administered by a collaboration of different organizations coming and working together. But even though we extol the virtues, we also have to understand that there are some challenges for organizations in working in these collaborative networks. And some of those challenges are addressed in the Agranoff article. So let's spend a few minutes taking a look at Bob Agranoff's article, because I think it's probably the best article that really does encapsulate where the research stands in terms of governing networks and really gives us what he calls 10 basic lessons that we have learned through our study over the years of these governing networks. And so if you don't have your book with you, that's fine. But I do want to kind of go through the article and talk about those 10 different types of lessons that we have learned from the literature. And again, this is an article it's not a brand new article. I think it's from like 2006. So he's really talking about the nature of the literature up to that point in 2006. But a lot of the work in network literature really took place in the early 2000s. And so I think it kind of encapsulates a lot of the great lessons. So he says there are 10 basic lessons that we have learned about organizations working in these collaborative networks. So he says lesson number one, I got to wear my glasses because I'm getting old here, but lesson number one, the network is not the only vehicle of collaborative management. What he means there is even though the literature has really turned its attention to these collaborative networks, we have to recognize that collaboration is just one way in which organizations work together. Organizations also work together in bilateral agreements between two organizations. So they may not put together this huge, ornate, very complex network of multiple organizations. They might just work in terms of bilateral agreements between two different organizations. They may work in a very informal manner where they just informally communicate with other organizations and share information with another organization outside of the development of this very complex type of governing network. Lesson number two, he says, is that managers continue to do the bulk of their work within the hierarchy. As I mentioned before, in his study, only about 15 to 20% of the total work time was spent in these collaborative networks. 80 to 85% of work time is still spent within a given organization. So you can really look at these networks as being much more complementary as opposed to kind of supplanting these organizations, these traditional governmental agencies. Lesson three, he says, is that network involvement brings several advantages that keep busy administrators involved, meaning that there must be some benefits to being in a collaborative network to keep organizations and leaders involved in these collaborative networks. And he talks about some of those benefits that we get from working in these collaborative networks, things such as that you learn new ways to collaborate, you learn new governmental skills from working with other organizations. Second, he says the benefits that accrue to the home agencies, such as access to the information of other organizations. So information sharing is another benefit. He says third is the collective process skills that accrue from working together. We know that's one of the benefits of group work, is that sometimes when we work together in a group, we can leverage the knowledge and the skills of all the people in the group, and the collective knowledge and skills of a group oftentimes will outweigh the knowledge and skills of one individual or one given agency. He says the fourth benefit that accrues will be the actual action plans, the actual tangible plans that come out of this collaboration. So he says, yes, indeed, the literature has shown us that working in these collaborative networks does provide a lot of these benefits. And it's these benefits that keep administrators coming back to working collaborative types of networks. The fourth lesson, he says, is that networks are different from organizations, but they are not completely different. That networks tend to be much more non-hierarchical than traditional organizations, but they still tend to have governing documents. He said virtually all of the 14 networks that he studied had some form of council or board or elected entire body of agency representatives, some type of a board of directors that ran the operations of this collaborative network. So there's still some type of a hierarchical governing type of system involved. Lesson number 5, not all networks make the types of policy and program adjustments ascribed to them in the literature. Basically, when we think about networks, we say they get together, these organizations get together to solve vexing, wicked policy problems. But he says that's not always the case. There are different types of networks, and he identifies 4 different types of networks. One type of network he refers to as an informational network, and they're there for the sharing of information between organizations. Second type of network he calls a developmental network. Says a developmental network is where they exchange technical information in order to build the capacity of the network and the organizations. Third are outreach types of networks. In outreach networks, they tend to exchange resources, but decision-making itself is not done by the network, but rather being done by the individual agencies. And then the fourth are action networks. In these action networks, these are the networks that actually end up making decisions. So these are the ones that come up with the action plans and actually make the decisions, hence the reason why they're referred to as action networks. The important thing about lesson number 5 is it tells us not all networks are created equal. When we study networks, we have to determine what type of network it is to best understand the purpose and the operations of that network. Are they informational? Are they developmental? Are they outreach-based? Or are they action-based? Lesson number 6, he says, collaborative decisions or agreements are the products of a particular type of mutual learning and adjustment. That oftentimes, as we had said before, these networks don't necessarily make decisions, they more reach agreements among themselves. And so kind of you think about the agency still having the veto power over any of these agreements that are reached by these collaborative types of networks. And to kind of hurry this up a little bit, I know we're pushing 7:30. Lesson number 3, the most distinctive collaborative activity in all the networks proved to be their work in public sector knowledge management. This is kind of an interesting one in that he is saying these networks manage knowledge and information. He says there are 2 types of knowledge. There is explicit knowledge, and then there is tacit knowledge. Explicit knowledge, according to Agranoff, is knowledge that can be codified and communicated easily in words, numbers, charts, and drawings. This is knowledge that is tangible and easily communicated to others, as opposed to tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge, he says, is embodied in senses, perceptions, experiences, intuition, and rules of thumb. So tacit knowledge is kind of subsumed. It's kind of knowledge that is, I should say, assumed as opposed to being tangible knowledge. But they manage both tangible, explicit, as well as tacit, more implicit knowledge. So there are knowledge management types of organizations. Lesson 8, despite their cooperative spirit, there are still conflicts and power struggles that go on in collaborative networks. It's not all sunshine and unicorns. When organizations come together in these collaborative networks, there can be conflict and there can be different power groups within these collaborative networks. He says there can be a power group such as champions. Champions are the visible, powerful, and prestigious public agency heads or chief executive officers within the collaborative network. Those are considered to be the champions. Then the second type is what's called the political core. The political core are the primary participating department heads or federal government state directors and chief executive officers of non-governmental organizations. So with your champions, they're usually coming from your public agencies. From your political core, they're usually coming from outside of traditional public agencies. Then you have your technical core. These are those individuals who have the technical expertise to add to the policies in the program, the implementation of those policies and those programs. And then finally, you have your paid staff. And your paid staff are the ones who are actually implementing a lot of these agreements that are reached by the collaborative network. So you have different power structures within these collaborative networks. Since you have these different power structures and you have these different conflicts going on, lesson 9 then tells us that there are costs that are associated with collaboration along with those benefits we've already identified. So he says some of the costs that are associated with participating in a network, giving up agency authority, giving up agency turf. And oftentimes agencies don't like giving up authority and giving up their own turf to participate in these governing networks. And just quickly, he also goes through some other types of costs. He says time and opportunity costs to the home agency. Obviously, you are going to reallocate some of your resources toward the network and away from the operations of the singular agency. Time and energy costs resulting from the protracted decision-making process that goes on in collaborative networks. Agreements not reached because of the exertion of organizational power or the withholding of the power. So some agencies will try and stop these agreements by exerting their power. Again, kind of those turf battles. Network gravitating toward consensus-based, risk-adverse decision agendas. Sometimes these collaborative networks, in order to stay alive, in order to keep these organizations together in these networks, will end up making very risk-adverse types of decisions. Resource hoarding or agency failure or unwillingness to contribute necessary resource. They would keep their resources to themselves rather than sharing them with the collaborative network. And then actual barriers within the design of policies themselves that may make it difficult for these networks to be successful. So there are costs associated with governing networks. It's not just all benefits. And then finally, lesson number 10. Networks alter the boundaries of the state only in most marginal ways. They do not appear to be replacing public bureaucracies in any way. They essentially operate alongside traditional public agencies. It is unlikely that they're ever going to actually supplant those public agencies. Most legislation, most policies enable these agencies to exist. And so therefore these agencies have that type of legal standing. And that type of legal standing oftentimes is more lacking in these governing networks. So I think what we can think of with these governing networks and the moral of the story is what we've learned about governing networks is that they're not all sunshine and roses, that there are some conflicts, but they do provide some tangible and intangible benefits. And if they didn't, organizations and leaders wouldn't waste their time with these collaborative types of networks. And finally, that these networks are very complementary. They are complementary. They work alongside traditional agencies. It's unlikely that they're ever going to replace those traditional public agencies. But we do have to recognize that a lot of our programs and a lot of our policies are implemented through these collaborative types of networks. And that's really the reality of modern public administration. If you're very interested in collaborative networks, again, I think the Agrinoff article is a great article. Another author that you might want to take a look at is an author by the name of Jack Meek, a colleague of mine with NASPA. He actually, I think he's just recently retired from the University of Laverne, of all places, but he has done a lot of work in governing networks and really devoted a lot of his career to research on networks. And so he's another good author to take a look at. But when you have these networks and when you have these types of partnerships between public and private organizations and public and nonprofit organizations, we always run this risk of what's called agency capture. And I'm sure you've heard about agency capture before. Agency capture is when within these collaborative efforts, you have one entity end up kind of co-opting the other entity. This happens a lot in terms of regulation. So when you have a regulatory agency that is responsible for regulating some business sector, and then those private corporations end up capturing the agency. They end up actually co-opting that agency and getting that agency to then kind of do their bidding and to do what's in the best interest of that corporation. If you think back to our discussion of power in John Gaventa, this is a great example of that third face of power, this co-optation. And we've got a lot of examples throughout history of agencies being captured by other entities in their external environment. Some common areas where we see agency capture occurring, things like an environmental regulation. And so if we have an environmental regulatory agency that is supposed to regulate private corporations, sometimes they'll end up being captured by those private corporations. They'll end up looking the other way with environmental violations or not applying the environmental regulations in the way in which those regulations should be applied. One very prominent example in recent history, financial services. We saw that some governmental regulatory agencies were co-opted by mortgage companies and by the mortgage industry. That led to a lot of those speculative mortgages that were being handed out, that then led to a lot of foreclosures, a lot of defaults, that then led to the housing crisis in the late 2000, 2008 or 2009, led to that housing crisis. And again, it was because a lot of those watchdog agencies were actually captured by the mortgage industry itself. From more distant history, we have transportation as another example of agency capture. The Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, that was created in the 1880s, was supposed to regulate commerce. The problem was that it ended up getting captured by railroads. And so these railroad magnates then were able, through a lot of unethical activities, to exert influence over the Interstate Commerce Commission, so much so that the ICC became so captured by the railroad industry that eventually the ICC was abolished. One of the classic examples in public administration, coming to us from an author named Phil Selznick, is the example of the Tennessee Valley Authority, and how the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was meant to regulate energy production, actually ended up being captured by the energy industry. So agencies have to be careful when they engage in interactions with other entities in their external environment, that they avoid this problem of agency capture and they continue to do their job rather than doing the bidding of those that they are supposed to be regulating. Whenever we have these collaborative efforts, we also have this problem with the principal-agent relationship, in that sometimes it becomes very difficult for the principal, the overseers, such as Congress, to know who to hold responsible. Who is responsible for this action? It's sometimes difficult for them to kind of untangle these networks and these collaborative types of efforts because they become very much like a spider web. And it's difficult to determine who did what and when they did it. And so it presents problems for this principal-agent relationship. We're not going to go through this again because we talked at length about the principal-agent relationship, but we do know that in order for the principal to oversee the actions of the agent, that principal must know what the agent is doing. And oftentimes information asymmetry makes that an impossible job for the principal. So when we get into these collaborative networks and this cooperation, it's, again, not all sunshine and roses. There are some problems that are associated with this type of collaboration. But we do know that collaboration really has become the issue of the day, if you will, for public organizations. And if you work in a public organization, your organization probably collaborates with other public and nonprofit and sometimes private organizations to carry out your daily functions. So when we come back from our break, we will do a breakout group. And in this breakout group, we are going to examine this idea of collaboration and governing networks from your perspective with your organization or an organization that you are familiar with. So it is 7:33, so let's go ahead and take our break. I know it's a little bit later than we usually do. Let's take a break until 7:45. And then we come back at 7:45, we'll walk through what we're going to do in our breakout groups. Then I'll break you up into the groups. We'll spend about half an hour or so working in our groups, reconvene, see what the groups came up with. And I think that will probably then be the end of our time together for tonight. So take a break, come back at 7:45, and we will do this breakout exercise. Okay, it's 7:45, so welcome back. Let's do our breakout groups now. And so what I have on screen there for you is what I would like for each group to do. So I want each group to consider this idea of a governing networks and collaboration. Select one example of a network or type of collaborative effort that you are familiar with in doing the work of an organization. It could be a collaborative effort, for example, in the implementation of a policy or a program, but just some type of a collaborative effort or network that you are familiar with. Describe the collaboration, who was involved in the collaboration, how effective was the collaboration, and what could have been done differently to try and make this collaboration more effective. And so each group will focus on one example of a network or collaboration and answer those questions. As always, I would like for each group to select a spokesperson because we will spend about half an hour working on this. Then we'll come back, and then when we come back, we'll share out from each of our groups. I think last time we used 4 groups, and I think that actually worked pretty well. So let me go ahead and create our groups. So we'll do 4 groups again, 4, and we'll just do automatic assignments. So hopefully you'll get to work with some other folks other than who you worked with last time. Okay, we've got our groups established. It looks like we have got 9 people in 3 of the groups and 8 people in the 4th group. So I'll send you on your way. And again, select a spokesperson, answer those questions, and I'll give you about half an hour. Then we'll reconvene and see what you came up with. So I'll open the rooms and then you can have at it. Okay, yeah, it looks like I think we're all back. So let's go ahead and see what each group came up with. So let's start with room number 1. In room
Hi,
1.
everyone.
Okay, there
This
we go.
is, sorry, I couldn't unmute. This is Susanna, and our group decided to discuss, uh, I guess, okay, so I work for Election Operations and Logistics Bureau, which is part of RRCC, and we decided to discuss the operations and the collaboration uh, in our department. And basically, our department is even though it's Registrar Recorder's Office, Election Operations and Logistics Bureau is a branch of it. We are not in the same building as the rest of the RRCC. We're in a warehouse where you could also find all the ballots and all the equipment, a lot of equipment. But our collaboration is with also outside companies such as Smartmatic, who is a logistics company. We are contracted with them for years now, and what they do is they started building our uh, voting machines, and they also store them. They store them in special. It's a warehouse that's about 40,000 square feet, so they store them there. We share the same platform, informational platform online, and they can access our information. We can access some of theirs to collaborate and to basically coordinate delivery of the equipment and just preparation all the way until the vote centers open. We also collaborate with AT&T. We're contracted with them who go to vote centers and survey to make sure the internet connectivity is there, the electrical power is efficient enough to make all the electronics work to help us out. That way they go do that almost every election. Most of the time, they are separated into 2 groups. One does just the technical stuff that has to do with the internet, and the other one does uh, specifically the electrical power. And sometimes, actually, I didn't say this in my group, but if there isn't enough electricity, we use we have to collaborate with our sites, and so we also collaborate with the sites and city clerks to help us. If it's with city clerks, if it's a public building, they help us sometimes negotiate when it comes to, uh, sorry, I'm stumbling on words because there's a lot going on in the background here. Guys, sorry about that. So basically the city clerks are one group that we collaborate with. Smartmatic, AT&T, all of us are in collaboration to make every single vote center happen. I work as an account manager for RCC, so what my job is to be basically the main communication channel between all the sites, Smartmatic, our group, field representatives who are part of our department who are out there surveying to make sure we have enough accessible vote centers. They survey every single one. First, what we do is recruit sites. We research district by district. We use Google Maps a lot of times. We recruit these sites. Then we send field representatives to those sites who bring back all the data. And then from there, we start sifting through everything to find the most accessible ones. Um, so that's the collaboration, I guess, of different agencies and stakeholders. How effective was the collaboration? Well, the last collaboration was pretty effective. And right now, I guess this is, again, time for elections. Right now, we've gotten to a point where we went through over 6,000 sites to pick only 645. There's a certain amount that has to belong to each district, and some of them are 4-day vote centers and some are 11-day vote centers. They have to be in combination, and each district, depending on its size, has a certain amount of those. And so we are down to 645, and we're doing a pretty efficient job. We have a few sites that we're still dealing with, but we're pretty close. We're like a month away from elections, and we've reached the point where most of our sites are already set, and all the logistical and planning is done. Um, what could have been done differently to make this collaboration more effective? I think we were discussing this in our group. If LA County would have helped us with maybe better funding, it would help with the process because going through thousands of sites and sending field representatives to we have limited field representatives basically and account managers to do this job. And sometimes we have to work more than 8 hours, 10 to 12 hours at times. So it would be helpful to have better funding to hire more people to help us do this. During the election period, we're also on standby. Um, Last election period, I was working. There was a day when I worked 18 hours because uh, we are responsible for the vote centers that are assigned to us. So until that vote center is locked up for the day, we are not allowed to log off. So um, it's a really big operation. Does anyone, I don't know if anyone can ask questions or is that it? I don't want to take up too much time.
Sure. I mean, does anyone have any questions? I know that it's amazing to me the logistics that go into that process. And I wish there was a way that all voters could know just how complicated the process is and just how really, at least from my perspective, how amazing it is that you're able to execute these elections as well as you are, given all the moving parts. It really is just amazing. But
Yes, it's a very big operation. I was telling our group that the federal government right now is in a lawsuit with us because they don't think we have enough accessible vote centers. So we had to do a lot of extra work just to prove in court that we checked all the sites and basically checked all the boxes that we could to find the most accessible ones because LA County, believe it or not, doesn't have too many fully accessible buildings. A lot of these buildings are not up to code. They've been built in the 70s, in the 60s. So it's a big task. It's a very interesting one as well.
absolutely. Yeah, a great
Yeah.
example. And like I said, it's amazing the work that gets done to make these elections happen. It just, LA County is just such a massive place to be able to effectively and efficiently do that process. So thank you, Susanna. Very well done.
Thank you.
How about group number two?
Hi, I believe that was us. Sorry, in case. So I was telling my group that I work for El Nido Family Service Center. It's a nonprofit organization. So part of we have multiple programs that we have, but my specific program is for selective home visiting program. And right now I am a supervisor of a grant that we just got from State Block Grant, and that comes from the Family First Preventions Act. And as part of that act, we're supposed to be mostly servicing from families from DCFS. So these referrals are supposed to come from DCFS, but on top of that, so who I work collaboratively is because since we're supposed to be servicing from families from DCFS, these we're only supposed to focus on them specifically and the families. They don't have to be in the system, but as long as they got some type of contact between some type of social worker. So the collaboration that I work with in agencies is DPH, so Department of Public Health, the Department of Social Services, and the Department of DCFS as well too. How effective is this grant right now? And working collaboratively with them, it's not effective if you ask for my opinion, because we just got this grant in January. I didn't hop in to start supervising till March. And on top of that, there's constant changes of reports. There's constant changes. We want to see where these referrals are coming to. All these organizations that have this specific grant as well too have low numbers. They're not getting any referrals. When we get communication with DCFS, they're saying they're doing one way, but then the organizations like one of like mine, we're not getting anything. So it's the constant changes and then constant meeting and then constant multiple groups of individuals in these collaboration meetings that nobody knows nothing on top of data, you know. And then, so what I would have done differently is instead of providing just a referral, like the scope of work, it's also already implementing some type of form instead of going along with it, you know? And that's what I feel like right now, what's going on with this specific program that's happening is everyone's just going along with it, but no one's meeting the numbers that they want us to all meet. And that's it.
Okay, good. Thank you, Sally. Well done. And yeah, I can hear the frustration and the frustration in your voice about how it certainly could be improved. But that's a great example of all these different organizations have to work together in this symbiotic relationship. And you've got, right off top, you mentioned, three major organizations, large organizations that have to work together that all have different, somewhat different missions. And so bringing those organizations together certainly can be difficult. So that's a great example. So thank you. Let's do room number 3.
Hi, everyone. So with our group, we started a little bit specific, and then we realized that we all kind of had either heard or similar experiences with the topic. So we were talking about COVID-19 relief funding. And with that funding, a lot of counties and cities and different jurisdictions received funding for the impacts of COVID-19. And so they had to partner with a lot of CBOs, a lot of nonprofits, school districts, Office of Education, homeless teams, et cetera. And they had to collaborate to roll out programs or projects that would relieve some of those impacts. For example, some communities received funding to construct a park. Some received funding for broadband access, which with COVID, we saw that students had to do their studies from home, and some areas, of course, didn't have good access to the internet and weren't able to perform as well. And so we found that the collaboration between these organizations was pretty good because some of the outcomes were good, the programs were doing well. As I mentioned, the park that received funding, that park that community hadn't had a park for, I believe, like 20 years. And so, those are good outcomes that we see. However, as we learned today, some of these programs or organizations can end up dying out. And because COVID funding was one-time funding, a lot of the programs will end up dying out. And so something that we would have tried to do differently was set them up with different avenues of funding for the future, or perhaps not funding programs that we know would end up dying out. Programs that are having good outcomes right now, but then would have to end, and essentially end those services or resources for communities that need them. And yeah, I think in essence that was that was the summary of what we discussed. And if you guys have questions, please feel free.
Thank you very much, Monica. And I agree with you. That was one of the difficulties is that you had this COVID relief funding that, had a lifespan, and then you have expectancy theory. And so once people start receiving some benefits, then they expect to continue to receive those types of benefits. But then once that money goes away, then it's up to those governments, those organizations to decide, well, either those services go away or we have to reallocate funds to keep those services going, which means there are opportunity costs that will then have to take funding away from other things that we are trying to do. And so that kind of ran headlong into the face of expectancy theory. And so that was pretty problematic. And I know in my district, we did the broadband access, and we did hotspots for our students and our families that did not have access to the internet. And that was a complicated process. And that took a while to roll that out, so long that some of our families, we were well into the COVID pandemic. We were well into remote learning, 6 months into remote learning before those hotspots actually came online for those families. And so it was kind of a glitchy process to say the least. And so it can be a difficult process, especially when you have that temporary type of money. So well done. Thank you, Monica. And thank you, group number 3. And we will then finish it up with group number 4.
Hello, my name's Enriqueta Olmos. So I'm part of group number 4. I'm part of a group called Delete the Divide, and we're part of the Internal Services Department of the County of Los Angeles. And it's really a program to help delete the technology divide amongst underserved communities. So we were invited to do a collaboration with the San Gabriel Valley YWCA. And we particularly were invited to an event that was for seniors. So it was open to the community of the age 60 and up. And it was a mini market. So they had a food drive at this event, and they had a lot of different organizations there. So the different groups that were there, we considered the community members to be the primary stakeholders. And then we considered the secondary stakeholders to be the YWCA, which were the ones that organized the event, as well as the different groups that were there. So aging and disabilities was there. I know there was LA Public Library was there. They were also giving out food, which I believe might have been the CalFresh group. There was a lot of different things going on at this event, and we considered the trickle down of the tertiary stakeholders to be like family members of the community as well, that might have been benefiting from the things available at this event. How effective was this? We considered this to be a very effective collaboration because we are actually continuing the collaboration because this event did so well. We're actually continuing to help at this YWCA by doing additional collaborations, by doing courses for seniors to learn how to use technology. So we actually go there and teach the seniors how to use their phones, their iPads, or computers. So anything that they might need help with. So I considered this collaboration to be a really great one because now we're continuing to do it. And then some of the things that we discussed as a group that maybe could have been done better was to provide transportation to the event, because we discussed that many seniors might not have the ability to attend the event. So we discussed amongst our group that maybe providing school buses or public transport or paratransit would be something that could help. And then maybe doing health screenings at the event and clothing drive. I know people in my group mentioned that these all things would have been great at the event to help facilitate things for the seniors that they need and mental health access as well. So I think this was a really great collaboration, and we're continuing the collaboration because it went so well.
Great, perfect. Thank you very much. And yeah, uh, that's an extremely important topic, and something that's very difficult to do is to, reduce and hopefully eliminate that divide. And you bring up a really great point that has really come out very strongly in the collaboration literature, whether it be collaboration between private and nonprofits, or whether it be collaboration between different types of governments. And that's the importance of initial success. It sounds like that collaboration had initial success, and so you build off of that initial success. And organizations tend to continue to engage in collaboration when they've had a positive experience. And so that first positive experience has then led your organization to continue that collaboration and expand that collaboration. So you're kind of going through the building of capacity type of phase now in that collaborative relationship. And so it's really great to hear that you're adding on additional types of services and will add on more services in the future. And it sounds like that collaborative relationship is just going to continue to grow in the future. So that's very good news. Very well done. So thank you very much. Again, I think it's great that in these groups that we can actually see some real examples of collaboration in some of these networks actually at play. So we can take some of the things we talked about in the first half of class and actually then apply them to how they're actually working in practice. So thank you very much. Really appreciate your work in our groups. Thank you to all of our spokespersons. I couldn't do it without you. So great job by everyone. That kind of wraps up what we cover for tonight. As we move into next week, we'll get back together again next Monday. And next Monday, we'll get more into the public organization theory literature. And we'll go through the evolution of how we have studied public organizations over the past 150 years, with our focus primarily being on the differences between different schools of thought and different theories, as well as some of the themes that kind of tie these different theories together. And I think our goal at the end of class next week is that we'll be able to kind of see how the literature has evolved and kind of see where we started in the late 1800s to where we currently are today with how we study our public organizations. So that'll be the topic for next Monday. I look forward to reading your next Canvas essay, which is due next week. And then I hope you have a great week. If you have any questions, reach out to me. Otherwise, I will talk to you again then at 6 o'clock next Monday. Take care, everyone. Thank you again.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.